Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest episode of the Exhorter podcast. We are bringing a topic to you today that is very relevant and one that we may not talk about as often as we should. And John, you are bringing this topic for us today. So why don't you lead us off on what is really an important topic and one that we don't probably talk about enough?
In one of the most recent episodes we had, mental health, mental illness in Christianity, we alluded to probably talking about this subject, and it's because it's really connected. And we've actually had some interest from high schoolers asking questions about this topic. And so the idea of taking one's own life or suicide is we just don't talk about it. And I think it's because there's still a lot we don't really know about it definitively. And we probably shouldn't talk about things a lot that we don't really definitively know. But I do think we can have a discussion about it today, because the more we have discussions about these kinds of things, mental health, suicide, the less stigma there is, the less worry and shock there is when these things happen. We kind of then maybe have a way to process and know about them a little easier. And I think that's what's really important to give more generations beyond us, is just an understanding that we're not just hands off about topics because we don't have all the answers. We need to be willing to have these discussions.
And I'd also say, John, this is one of those topics that, similar to, say, divorce for me, it's something that unless you experience it personally in your life, where someone that you love has been lost, or a friend, that it hits you differently, and you think about it probably in a different way. And it really hit me that our high school class, was asking questions about this important topic, and it is a critical topic. So I'm so glad that you brought this topic today, John.
Well, one of the reasons why is the National Institute of Mental Health says it's the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34, fourth for ages 35 to 54, and eighth leading cause of death from ages 55 to 64. Approximately 123 Americans died by suicide. That's about one death every 12 minutes. So unfortunately, it occurs in all areas of life, no matter a person's background, ethnicity, poverty level, anything. And so it's so relevant and prevalent, especially coming after a pandemic. There's a lot of topics like this that are thrust into the spotlight and talked about amongst our kids and amongst society, that members of the church, we need to stop kind of being afraid to talk about these things. We need to have more discussions. And so a podcast episode, I think, is the great way to start. There are some questions here I can list out for us, but at the end of the day, we're not going to answer all of them. I just want to be sure of that one. But we're going to give our perspective about these, and hopefully that leads to just further study and further conversation to make this not so of a stigma that we can't talk about it.
Well, it is something that, as you said, is in the spotlight, and it's not something that is just based on economics. You might assume that someone that is poor is more susceptible, but we see it amongst celebrities, and that's where it's in the spotlight. Notable examples in recent years include Robin Williams, Chester Bennington, the singer from Linkin Park. Even just not even a month ago, Jason David Frank, the Green Power Ranger, for those that grew up watching that show.
Yeah.
And so we see examples like this, and it's something that can't be ignored. And it's not just based on poverty. Even those who are wealthy or famous struggle with this subject as well.
Yeah.
I also wonder if one of the reasons we don't talk about it is maybe not because it's a mystery. I wonder if people almost have their mind made up about it before even discussing it. So it's kind of a closed matter.
There are a lot of just black and white views about it that a lot of people take. And if you do some research, you look out there about perspectives from other religions or other societies, there's some really strong views people have about this.
Well, and it's not just religion. I think the biggest religion of all in America is pop culture. And I recall watching a movie. It's been a long time, but I recall watching a movie, oddly enough, with Robin Williams, called What Dreams May Come. I think one of the major premise of that movie is that he dies, his wife commits suicide, and it's about his journey in the afterlife. And none of this is biblical, obviously, but it's about his journey in the afterlife, trying to bring her from the dark side, or I don't know if they even called it hell, but that concept, to heaven, back to the light. And the whole idea is that, and I think one of the main points of the movie is that if you take your own life, then access to heaven is forbidden. And so it kind of permeates even pop culture, which isn't based on biblical knowledge at all, but it's what people hear and think.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why it's just a scary topic to talk about is because, we don't want people committing suicide, to be frank, right? We don't want that. So why would you give any sort of misconception that there is any question about what will happen to you if you do? And so I think it's one of those things is we're kind of afraid to give any open door perspective to someone who is, in that much pain and hopelessness. And we don't want to give anyone an out. We don't really want to give anyone opportunity to question that. So we need to be very strong and definitive about it. And unfortunately, fear drives a lot of, even in the church, speaking where the Bible doesn't speak, or us trying to make hard lines rather than trying to have tough conversations. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think, John, we were talking earlier about the fact that sometimes I think the word I was thinking of was scare tactic. I don't mean that that was the intention of some people, but when you talk to anybody who it's ever thought about it, the idea of not being with God forever would scare someone to say, even a Christian, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want any chance of not being there. But even thinking about suicide, I should say we see suicide in the Bible. We see people in the Bible who committed suicide or thought about suicide. Some of the most famous examples are people of God, people that God was working through that committed suicide or sometimes even asked God to kill them based on how they felt at the moment.
Well, let's give a little background in the Bible of suicide. There are 7 prominent suicides, I think, that people kind of look at, and some of them are not well-known people, but we have Abimelech, who before someone else could slay him, he requested his people to slay him. That was in Judges 9. Saul took his sword and fell on it. Saul's armor bearer, he falls on his own sword as well in 1 Samuel. Ahithophel. Sorry, yeah. Ahithophel hung himself. And in 2 Samuel, Zimri jumped into fire. We might be a mental health concern there because that's like one of the worst ways I can think to go. And then we have the very well most known is Judas, hung himself in Matthew 27. And then some actually attribute Samson, although him trying to take out the Philistines, his direct actions did take his own life as well. And he knew that it would. So that's one of the borderlines. Most people don't consider it suicide, and we don't have to.
Hebrews 11 would indicate that was an action of faith.
Right.
So that one is a little bit, I think it's more, maybe not as heroic, but I think it's more akin to sacrificing your life, like
going into battle against
jumping on a grenade.
Odds. But still one of those, that of a conversation that we can learn from. And then you have people, Paul mentioned, you have Jonah, Elijah, Solomon, Paul, all felt, at some point in time, they hated life. They despaired in life itself, and they were asking God and yearning for the end of it. Most famously, Paul says that in 2 Corinthians 1:8, where he despaired for life itself. We see desperation. We see what it causes. Now, I do see that those who committed suicide had a lot more fear in something else. They decided to take a different route.
Most of them seem to be characterized not by heroism or bravery, but more characterized by a lack of faith, if you will.
Right.
The idea that I'm going to make a choice that isn't based upon God and isn't based upon faith. I'm going to make a choice that's based upon, I'm reading the situation and I'm making a choice based upon my eyes and what I can see and my limited ability. We don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, or let alone 5 minutes from now. So,
and I think that's the reason right there that has led to sermons and lots of discussion, lots of feelings that suicide is a result of not having enough faith in God and leaning on God. And that's why people like Paul, who got through that despair, had faith in God. And I'd say, just like when we talked about mental health, there are 2 sides of these things. Absolutely. God has all the power in the world to save you from yourself. But then there is also the question about mental health. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, the question I wanted to throw out there, we're just going to get straight into it. Is suicide a sin? Most of the time, it's talked about as a sin. It's because it's attributed to murder.
I think my initial reaction is yes. We're going to talk about it as a sin. It's something that God does. Murder itself, like you said, that's the closest maybe comparable thing we can find in the Bible. And murder is condemned plainly in both testaments,
Mhm.
clearly against the will of God. And I don't see positive examples of someone committing suicide in the Bible where it seems to approve of their actions. So I feel pretty comfortable in saying it's certainly not God's will, and
Right.
and that it does categorize as sin.
Now, I think I agree because we know we belong to another and our life is not our own to take. That simple fact that if we do take it, we're doing something against God's innate will for us.
It's dethroning him as the king in our lives. It's choosing that he is not the sovereign authority that guides my steps. It's taking control. It's essentially how Satan convinced Eve in the garden. No. You eat the fruit, you reject his will. Right. Your eyes will be open. You'll be like him. You'll be your own God. You don't do what he says. Eve, you do what Eve tells you to do.
I think there's a caveat to that. But first, Paul, what was your thought about this?
I think of the fact that the Bible tells us that Satan is the father of lies. But it also says he was a murderer from the beginning. He comes to steal, to kill, to destroy, including planting destructive thoughts in the minds of Christians that may not be their own and may make them think about these thoughts. So I think the source of these thoughts is not from God. I believe it is from Satan. Where Jesus, on the other hand, he emphasizes the sanctity of life. He came to give us the abundant life. He doesn't want us to live in fear, but to discover strength in him. And, the Bible is clear that, as you said, John, we're made in the image of God. Our bodies are not our own. And it really goes against the natural tendency of humans with our bodies that are not our own to destroy that. But that's just the simple question of, is it a sin? I believe the source of it is Satan, who is the father of lies, who comes to deceive us. The question of how he deceives us and where that is, but ultimately then it's a sin to do that.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people frame it that as Christians, we have a sanctity of life ethic. And we talk about that all the time when we talk about abortion, when we talk about other hot topics in media, but also when we talk about just the value of life and what that means. And I don't think anyone really challenges that. So I think that caveat that I mentioned, though, is, are you free and knowingly taking your own life when you have a mental illness? A lot of times when people have survived suicide and then speak about it is this intense emotion and feeling of hopelessness and not intending on harming themselves, just stopping the pain. I don't think that doesn't make it not sin. But I do believe there are some conversations about when someone is under their own cognizance, as if someone who has special needs or who really doesn't understand what's going on. But then that kind of conversation makes people uncomfortable too, because people have used mental health, pleading insanity as a justification for all their actions that they've done for murder and other things. And so I think that's why it's uncomfortable for people to talk about the idea of mental health being in this conversation, because it feels like you're saying that's an excuse. I don't think that's what we're saying. There's a quote, "We don't know what happened between the bridge and the water." There have been some people who have survived suicide and that have said, as soon as they let go of that bridge, they 100% regretted their thoughts and their actions. What we really don't know is how God views that and what grace he attributes to whether or not they are freely and knowingly trying to take their life, or if they are subject and falling prey to this mental illness that they might have. And so I think that it kind of leads into another question, which is suicide forgivable? And it's a hard one because most of the time
there's a finality to it that is hard.
There's a finality to it. There's no time to.
It's hard to reconcile that finality.
In our mindset, there's no time to seek forgiveness once you fall prey to that.
I want you to think about something. Do you think your salvation depends upon dying at a moment where you have completely cleared the slate, ask for forgiveness for everything? Because what if you do that and the next day you go out and do something you shouldn't do? I mean, here's the thing. We think of being sinful as bad things we've done, okay? But being sinful is also not living up to all the good that God expects you to do.
Mm-hmm.
All right? There's sins of commission where we commit sins. There's sins of omission. We all fall short of God's glory. Do you think your salvation is dependent upon saying a prayer, asking for forgiveness, and then dying the next moment after that before you can commit a sin or fail to do what you should do?
Man, Kyle, you're just jumping into a whole nother podcast topic on grace. And we need to do that because I've been a part of some conversations, even just very recently, about the idea of what's the antithesis of once saved, always saved, once condemned, always condemned. Like I heard that and I'm like, that's a hard conversation.
What is the Princess Bride? What is it Vicini says about not getting in a land war in Asia? And I think the next biggest mistake is not getting in a comment section fight on Facebook.
Facebook, exactly. And that's one of the parts of this conversation that I'm saying that we can't necessarily resolve.
Yeah.
Because it's up to God, not us. It's up to God to resolve how he chooses to view grace that he's given us and his forgiveness that he's given us, and he will continue to give us.
And that's exactly what I was trying to suggest in my answer to your question is God calls upon us to make judgments at times, but we're not the judge. There's a difference there. Bad company corrupts good morals. We make a judgment. Who's bad company? That's a judgment we make, but it's not the same as being the judge and pronouncing a judgment. To say somebody's in heaven or somebody's in hell is not our place. The scripture does give us guidance, and we have an expectation on what kind of life leads to heaven, what kind of life leads to hell. And you brought up the idea of mental illness. There might be mental, physical, physiological burdens that someone just simply cannot bear. How do I know that? I don't. God knows what's in their heart. God knows what burdens they carry, even physiological, or we talk about chemistry of the brain. There might be things that I don't know. I'm not that person. I can't look in their head or in their heart and know what they're thinking and what they're feeling, but God does. That's why he's the perfect judge of these situations. My hope is that my salvation isn't based upon dying at an opportune moment. Now, to be clear, when I look in the Bible, I don't find a verse that says those who commit suicide have no hope of heaven. I don't see that in the Bible, so I'm not going to say that. Someone commits suicide, does it cast doubts in my mind about their salvation? Yeah. And here's the point you made at the very beginning of the episode.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to even make this point because I don't want to give someone that foothold, that crack the door open on this topic if that's what they're contemplating. But that is not the answer.
In 1 Corinthians 3, 16, 17, it starts off saying, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. A lot of people point to that and say definitively that is saying God has no part with you. How do we address when people are very sure that it's a sin and you're going to hell? It's a strong perspective out there.
Well, John, I think, you were mentioning passages in the Bible. We need to go to what the Bible says and not speculate beyond that. I think of John 5:22 that God has really delegated the authority to Jesus for judgment. And I know that Jesus, when I think about maybe a future podcast about the grace of God, and that maybe sometimes write that one down. Sometimes we don't appreciate or maybe even minimize just how amazing the grace of God is just for saving us in the first place, but let alone how far that may go. But to speculate further is going to be just that, speculation. And the question you're asking, John, I think goes back to if someone is not in their right mind, whether it be a mental illness, a chemical imbalance, or something that they act on anything that they may not even be in their full mental capacity when they do it. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're talking about. I have a son who can't really act with his mental capacities all the time because of, the disabilities that he has. But if someone, because of mental illness, is in a state like that, what does that mean? Well, I know for my son, my belief is that he's innocent because he doesn't even know what he's doing. Like a child. Mm-hmm. He's literally like a child. I don't know if that could happen when it comes to the chemical imbalance or the mental illness. But to Kyle's point, for people, we have two groups of people listening to this that I think we're both being very concerned about. One of them is if you're listening to this and you've lost someone you love to suicide, we're being very sensitive to that because we love those who we've lost, and it hurts already to lose that person, and then to think about where they may be. And we want to have hope that we're going to see them again. And the other audience that we're concerned about, we're listening to, is those who may be listening who have been in that place of hopelessness and have been in maybe similar places to biblical characters that we just read about, where that idea has crossed their mind. And to Kyle's point, we don't want to in any way make that decision easier that suggests, oh, there's an opportunity here. And I think we should just say here now, again and again, for anybody that's ever crossed their mind, suicide is not the answer. And it is not an answer that ever helps on earth. And it's not something you really should ever be thinking about as the solution.
Well, to a comment John made earlier, I think if you're in that second group that Paul mentioned, if you had talked to someone who's lost a loved one to suicide, they would tell you, we're not better off without them here. They didn't, removing themselves from this world didn't improve everyone else's life. It added grief. And so you're deceived. And Paul, I think you mentioned that earlier about thoughts from Satan. And maybe there's some selfless ideas there, but I think that's just the shroud that just covers up the darker problem behind it.
Can I say something? I get angry and frustrated when I hear someone speak about someone who's committed suicide from a definitive perspective that was a selfish act. They were a weak person. They might be right, but no one knows that more than those people who have been left behind. And I think that one of the things that we just need to do is just be more empathetic and sensitive and understanding to those people. It is something that we've seen people struggle through. People with kids, people, spouses left behind. We've seen people struggle through this, and that's not a way that you champion them and you come to their side by necessarily pointing your finger that person, I can't believe they did that to you. I can't believe that they already know that, people. They already feel that. That's already a part of their lives. They're there. I don't think they need that kind of forceful reminder of that. And I understand that's probably because you're looking at that second group of people trying to make sure that they understand, don't do this. This is no way to go. God hates this. And I understand that, but we have to speak to both crowds.
And the group you're talking about, John, is those who haven't experienced suicide. Because sometimes I've heard that from someone who has in their family, and they may be sharing their emotion for the moment because they're so frustrated because, they feel the grief and loss that Kyle was talking about. But if that's their emotions at the moment, and that's okay. But for someone who's not connected at all, mm-hmm. to make this general statement, I understand what you're saying.
And it could be right. It's a selfish act to be thinking about, removing myself from my family's life. I totally, mm-hmm. but that's not the comfort that's being needed by brethren. That's not the focus on what's being needed by brethren. The focus is the emotional and spiritual strength of that family.
We have a tendency to put ourselves in the minds and motivations of people. I remember talking to a family one time on a whole different topic, and it happened to be marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And the person shared with me that a particular writer changed his view on MDR because he had a daughter that went through divorce, and after that, he changed his mind. And I asked her, really, where did you get that information, and how do you know? Well, I just heard it. Someone passed it on to me, and it was one of those things of somebody just probably thought it. I believe I know your intentions. We have to remind ourselves only God knows what's in our hearts and minds, and the same thing is true with this topic.
Yeah, and I think we've all been in those situations where we start talking definitively about something, and then we get that kind of look from our spouse, like, stop talking. And you're reading, because you didn't read the room, right? You didn't realize, oh yeah, that person was divorced, or, just like your conversation. And I think we all fall prey to that. And so I think that just like other topics, this is definitely one of those that you just need to approach with an understanding of who might be touched by this in a way. And it's not because you're trying to sugarcoat or you're trying to change your doctrinal view. It's because, what is your goal? Our goal about talking about this topic today is to make it easier to talk about. And one of the ways that we don't do that is by being dogmatic and brash and unempathetic. And so that I just add that in there. I say that not to make anyone feel bad, but I say that as a plea for all of us to just approach this type of topic, that if you don't know what it's like, don't act like you do. And just be there for people in a way that you can. And that's not always with a doctrinal, forceful hand.
Being too definitive. A good rule to live by: don't ever, for any reason, do anything to anyone for any reason ever, no matter what, no matter where, or who you are with, or where you are going, or where you've been, ever, for any reason whatsoever. Little office humor for you guys.
I love the Michael Scott quote. I knew you were leading into that too.
But we love to ask the hard, unanswerable questions. We look something up and we want to know the answer.
Is it wrong of me to lighten up an episode like this?
No, it's not wrong. And I'd say my last question here, just as we kind of trail off here, is
I'll redeem myself. I've got a really good final thought on this topic.
My last question to you guys is it's simple. Is life worth living?
Okay, here's my final thought. The few instances, you talked about some examples of suicide in the Bible. We've got several examples of near suicide, or people that expressed a desire for it. And in those instances, we get some scriptural examples where God talks back. You never see God say, yeah, you're right. You probably should just, your life should just be over now. In Numbers chapter 11, when the people complain and Moses has had enough, he says, I'm not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now. You know what God says? Okay, Moses, I heard you. Let's get 70 elders to help you out and share the burden. His answer wasn't, okay, let's just end it right now. It's, Moses, we got more to do, but I hear you, and let's find a solution. In 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah running for his life from Jezebel. I can't take it anymore. I'm the last one left. And God says, no, there's 7,000. And you know what, Elijah? You need to go to Assyria and appoint a new king. You need to go to Israel and anoint a new king there. And you need to go find Elisha and anoint him as your successor. So his answer to Elijah was, no, you're not the only one left. I've still got more work for you to do. You're not done yet. You might think so, but you're not done yet. I wouldn't say that in Luke chapter 23, I wouldn't say that Peter was necessarily suicidal, but Jesus does tell him, Peter, you're going to deny me. Never. In fact, Peter, you're going to deny me this night, and you're going to do it 3 times. Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat. He wants to chew you up, Peter. But you know what? I've prayed that your faith won't fail. And after this happens, Peter, I need you to pick yourself up and go strengthen your brethren. So I know Peter wasn't necessarily suicidal in the sense like Elijah and Moses who expressed it, but we know Judas was. And Peter and Judas made similar mistakes. They both betrayed Jesus publicly. And we see that for Peter, the commentary we get from Jesus from the divine was, you're going to mess up, and you're going to mess up big, and you're going to feel this failure. But Peter, I'm not done with you. I have work for you to do still. So I just find it very compelling that in some of the examples where thoughts of suicide or ending it are expressed and God communicates back, the answer is always, I've got more for you to do.
I think it's because a lot of those men were so focused on the pain that they were feeling. And I think that's where a lot of us trip up on this walk. When we stop thinking about and knowing that our life is not ours, and we have a purpose here. And it's not just to have a great job and raise a family. It's to do God's will. And sometimes all that grief and pain that we have in this life is us trying to do something other than what God's focus and God's will is. We got to catch ourselves. We're all susceptible to that. We all sin when we look at our lives as something other than a tool for God's kingdom. And we are having down times. We need to really be thinking about, it's not about me.
God gave you the breath of life, and every breath of your life belongs to him. And Elijah's story reminds me so much of again, it's a failure to trust in God. It's a lack of faith that I see no way out from this despair. You don't always see the way out. When the Israelites were running away from the Egyptians, they get to the Red Sea and they think they're dead. They didn't see the way out. God said, it's right there in front of you. I'll just part the waters. Yeah. We don't see the way out, but God does. And that's where we need to take that leap into faith and say, I can't direct my own steps. I don't know what's coming or what's in the future. I can't see everything going on like God does.
Yeah.
So I just need to trust him. I'm curious, have either of you ever, I mean, maybe not seriously,
when I was
but
in high school, I remember having thoughts of like walking into traffic and whether or not anyone would know or care or care. But I mean, I think it's because I was bullied, and I also had very, I socially didn't necessarily have a group that I was, a part of. Didn't feel loved, didn't feel that kind of romantic life until after high school. And so I think that in high school, I definitely remember there being times that I just thought that what's the point? Nothing's really going my way. I remember having those thoughts.
So I just wonder how universal it is. If it's, I mean, maybe it's not, it doesn't get as far for everyone as like actually thinking about when am I going to do it or how am I, but like, I just wonder how universal.
A lot of people do. A lot of people will, and it doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but a lot of people will go through the motions of thinking and making thoughts and plans of how they would do it. Having thoughts of suicide is not uncommon. Having intense and continual thoughts of self-harm or suicide is not common. That's definitely where more conversation about this topic definitely is important. But most people, when they contemplate suicide, they're not thinking about, I think I remember hearing someone say, it's someone asking, why are you thinking about harming yourself? There's no harm in that, in ending this.
You're ending the pain.
You're ending the pain. And it's not necessarily this idea of like, I hate myself. It's this, I just can't figure out how to deal with this grief and this pain that I have. And I just want to get it away. People who go through struggles and traumas, 9, 10 o'clock at night is the worst time of the day. You're no longer around anyone. You're sitting in your own thoughts. You're sitting in your own feelings. There's no one to reach out to. I feel it's kind of late to like reach out to people. And you're just kind of sitting in that. And that's the thing that just sits and stews. And we can't think, it's not logical. We don't think rationally in those moments. But we can all at least understand disparity and what that looks like to people. It just means, creating those relationships and those connections between people is just so much more important, which is, as a deacon, and why do I try to do these like social events? Someone called me the cruise director thing. It's because people need those connections. I mean, it's not crazy to think that if you haven't walked up to someone in church and you don't really have never had a conversation with them, that there's no one else that has either, and they're alone. Well, thanks, guys, for the conversation. With the statistics alone, it's not the last time we're going to have this conversation. And I think it just prepares us to better help and support one another when we do. Where we should really be focusing in is on preventive measures by building strong relationships with each other and getting people to understand and ourselves. As Christians, we have a sanctity of life ethic here. Our goal is to promote life in the service of God and his kingdom. So if you guys have any additional thoughts?
Just to what Kyle said, I think you said it really well, but there's the phrase, it's always darkest right before dawn. And so if you're in that place where you feel like you're in a place of hopelessness, you're not alone. And as the examples Kyle gave, there's hope and often things you may not be thinking that are coming, that God has a purpose for your life. And it's better that you're here to be that. And so if you're thinking about that, John, you mentioned before, there's others who can help you. Don't do it alone. There's suicide hotlines. Take advantage of that. And if you're listening to this and you've been one who has lost one, we just want to say we love you. We don't attempt to know any more than what we read in the Bible. We don't want to speculate on anything more than that, other than to be understanding and sensitive to that. And as Christians, to mourn with those who mourn and help, but also to be on the lookout. Instead of wondering about things that we need to speculate, let's be watchful for those who may be struggling and try to help each other.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Paul, for your input on this very heavy subject. It's very relevant, much to consider on this. And we thank you for listening to the Exhorter podcast. If you found this episode or any other episodes to be helpful or an encouragement to you in your spiritual walk, we encourage you to please subscribe and get the latest episodes. Thank you.
Just one more thing, I always kind of like to do this on some of these subjects, is to just kind of make sure that we've covered all our bases. And a few years ago, I got to work with a suicide prevention advocate, and who, from his own life, his grandfather and his father both committed suicide, and he survived death by suicide himself. And so with that effort and work, we did do some lessons and some videos on helping people identify and understand kind of the warning signs and risk factors. And I just want to list a few off there too, just for your own understanding. This is definitely one of those topics that if you're a parent, if you are someone that is close to people who have emotional and mental needs, that you just kind of be aware of. Some risk factors for suicide may include relationship problems that may be related to things like family, social isolation, or bullying, past history of trauma or recent multiple major life changes, substance abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, or constant neglect, physical and mental health problems that go untreated or are improperly treated, job or financial problems, people who have been incarcerated in the criminal justice system, and loss of housing. And you don't need to have all those. You can have a subset of, usually it's multiple, but those are some of the risk factors of people's backgrounds that kind of lead to some of these warning signs. So some of the warning signs are talking about wanting to die or looking for a way to kill oneself, whether it's in person or online, talking about feeling hopelessness or having no reason to live, talking about feeling trapped in or in unbearable pain, talking about being a burden to others, increased use of alcohol or drugs, acting anxious, agitated, or behaving recklessly, sleeping too little or too much, withdrawal or feeling isolated from friends, family, and society, showing rage or talking about seeking revenge, displaying or experiencing extreme mood swings, preoccupation with death, appearing suddenly happier, calmer, loss of interest in things that one cares about, visiting or calling people to say goodbye, or making arrangements, setting one's affairs in order. Sometimes this might look like giving things away, such prized possessions. Like I said, with the risk factors, these warning signs are usually in multiples. If you experience any of these or you see these in others, this is more of a perspective of being able to look out for one beside you. Make sure that when people deal with these kinds of struggles, what you can do to help them. And just the first and foremost thing is there's a National Suicide Prevention Hotline, 800-273-8255, or the crisis text line, text GO to 741741. And there's a teen line for suicide prevention and crisis prevention, 800-852-8336. Seek out help if you need it or if you're concerned for a loved one. And once again, you can always call, message, and reach out to us here. We'd love to help you in any way we can. Thank you.